art-related lectures, films, divrei Torah, and hands-on workshops. If you look around the walls of this hall, you will see part of the Torah Stitch by Stitch installation, the rest of which is outside, which will be here for the next few months. Docent-led tours are offered every Tuesday, so please come and visit and learn more about it. Tonight's lecture is our first of the new year. It is fitting that the topic, Art as Midrash, is being discussed in this room. Midrash means commentary, more specifically commentary or interpretation of biblical texts. The art on the Torah Stitch by Stitch panels surrounding us are a contemporary example of art as Midrash. Now a word about the Joel Starkman Memorial Lecture. My husband Jordan and I lost a dear friend to cancer 2 years ago. Joel was a Renaissance man. He loved art and was an avid collector. He also loved cars and motorcycles, hats, building things, sailing, and lived a richly Jewish life with family and friends at the center. Whatever he was focused on, he did with passion, curiosity, and a keen artistic eye. Joel was working towards completing a PhD in Jewish studies at York University, focusing on art and the Bible when he died. After his death, a group of his childhood friends committed to sponsoring a yearly lecture on art and Jewish studies at a synagogue in Joel's honor. We are fortunate to have Professor Carl Ehrlich here tonight to give the inaugural lecture. Dr. Ehrlich was Joel's supervisor at York, but more importantly, he and Joel shared an interest in the intersection of art and Jewish culture. Professor Ehrlich received his BA magna cum laude in Judaic Studies from the University of Massachusetts in 1976. And his MA and PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from Harvard University. He is currently Professor of Hebrew Bible in the Department of Humanities at York University, where he has also served as Coordinator of Religious Studies and Associate Director of the Center for Jewish Studies. Professor Ehrlich has taught at Oberlin College and Vassar College in the United States and at various esteemed institutions in Germany. From 1992 to 2001, he served as Associate Director of the Tel Es-Safi Gath Archaeological Project. In 2010 and 11, he served as a guest professor in Judaic Studies at the University of California at San Diego and at the University of Zurich, Switzerland. Professor Ehrlich has authored 3 books, as well as numerous articles and chapters in professional journals, and many others. He has also edited 2 volumes about ancient Near Eastern literature. His current projects include a cultural history of Moses, a new annotated translation of the Hebrew Bible into German, a commentary on the Book of Chronicles, and a collection of essays on purity and holiness in ancient Israel, Judaism, and Christianity. Professor Ehrlich is married to Rabbi Michal Shekel, and they have 2 sons. In addition to his academic interests and achievements, he is an opera buff and a die-hard Red Sox fan, and is often to be found perusing works of art. We look forward to his perusals tonight. Professor Ehrlich.
Thanks a lot for that wonderful introduction. I have to admit, though, I've got to see what website you got that from, since the information is somewhat outdated. But no, that's okay. You know, it's in the ballpark. I hope you all can see the screen. If not, we're going to ask to have the lights here turned down. Because we will be looking at works of art eventually, once I get past my somewhat lengthy introduction. It is hard to believe that 2 years have already gone by since my student and friend, Joel Starkman, passed away at an all too young age, leaving behind a grieving family and countless friends. Joel was a gregarious force of nature who seemed to know or be related to just about everyone in the GTA and beyond. At the time, and many of these people are here this evening, at the time of his passing, he had been my student for about 4 years or so. He had taken a number of courses with me, written his York equivalent of an MA thesis under my direction, and commenced his PhD studies under my supervision when his illness tragically intervened. I remember with great fondness our times together, talking about our mutual interests, our respective families, and our plans for the future. Indeed, Joel was such a good conversationalist that I made sure not to schedule anything after our appointments, since I knew we'd be schmoozing for quite a while. The last time I saw him, just a few short weeks before his passing, he was still making plans for lectures and presentations that sadly never took place. Although we came to the subject matter from different directions, we shared a common passion for the study of art as a form of biblical interpretation or Midrash. In this vein, Joel's MA thesis examined Robert Crumb's graphic version of the book of Genesis. How appropriate, then, to be giving this talk today in this ambiance, surrounded as we are by Tema Gentle's monumental Torah stitch-by-stitch project, with which Joel would have loved to have seen. I am truly honored to have been asked to present this first annual lecture in Joel's memory in the presence of his loving family and friends. May we all find ourselves worthy of carrying on his legacy as best as we can. Those who know me, to some extent, are aware that I am a lover of art, literature, and music. Unfortunately, one of the unexpected consequences of pursuing a full-time academic career is that one has appreciably less time than one had in one's youth to pursue one's extracurricular passions. Thus it has gone with me in the last couple of decades. The more I devote myself to my teaching and scholarship, not to mention administrative tasks, the less time I have to appreciate the multifaceted creations of the human spirit. Be that as it may, the field of cultural studies and its subfield of cultural history have provided me with the opportunity to combine my academic and extracurricular interests, as has an expanding definition within biblical studies of the scope of what is called reception history. Thus, I have begun to investigate artistic creations according to the broadest possible definition as interpretations of the biblical text. My interests lie not in ars gratia artis, in other words, art for the sake of art, but in art as hermeneutics or as midrash. Midrash, as most of you probably know, and as Rona has told us a couple of minutes ago, is the general term for the traditional Jewish methods of interpreting the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh. As a literary genre, Midrash is classified either as Midrash Halacha, the nuts and bolts interpretation of Jewish law and custom, or as Midrash Agadah, the homiletic or narrative tradition, which uses accessible language and imagery to convey a moral or a lesson. It is the second type of Midrash, the Midrash Agadah, which interests me in the context of today's presentation. This is the type of Midrash that fills in gaps in the biblical narrative, answers questions raised by the text, and rewrites the text for a new age according to the needs of more modern sensibilities. In principle, it is possible to view artistic creations, no matter what their sources, as examples of Midrash, whether they be pictorial art, literature, music, or even film. When they attempt to retell the stories of the biblical text, they are of necessity forced to interpret the text. My aim in the following minutes is to illustrate the dialectic relationship between the artistic creation and its textual basis through an examination of the different interpretative possibilities inherent in pictorial representations of the story of Samson and Delilah. My interest lies not in the individual images as art, but in the relationship between artistic creation and biblical text. However, before I begin this investigation, let me echo the original or real Star Trek's Dr. McCoy in declaring that, damn it, I'm a doctor of biblical studies and not an art historian. My interest in the artworks I will be discussing today is in examining how visual art may serve as a form of Midrash, both interpreting the biblical text and filling in perceived gaps in the biblical narrative. By placing the selected artworks in a historical framework reaching from the 14th to the 21st centuries, I hope to illustrate in part how artistic interpretations are reflective of their contemporaneous zeitgeist. But first, a few remarks about the biblical narrative that is the subject of our discussion. The story of Samson and Delilah is to be found in the biblical book of Judges. This book consists of 3 major sections. The first part includes 2 introductions to the book, which form a bridge between the story of the conquest and allotment of the promised land as recounted in the book of Joshua, and the actual period of the Judges, or as sociologist Max Weber termed them, charismatic leaders, who according to tradition led the disparate Israelite tribes in the century or 2 before the monarchy was introduced around 1000 BCE. These introductory chapters also include a theology of history, in which the relationship between God and Israel is presented as a cyclically dysfunctional one, moving from sin to punishment to repentance to salvation, before starting over again with a renewed sin. The third and last part of Judges is again devoted to a transitional period, leading from the time of Judges to that of the kings of Israel and Judah. The 2 larger narrative cycles that make up this section recount the precipitous decline of social and religious order in the absence of a central political authority, something that in some of our opinions may be currently mirrored in the United States. The story of Samson and Delilah, however, is to be found in the second part and central part of Judges. In this major section of the book, various local traditions or legends have been brought together in an artificial running narrative. In this manner, these originally independent and presumably oftentimes overlapping local heroes or judges are presented as successive leaders of the Israelites. Yet among these stories, the one concerning Samson, the last of the judges, is exceptional. Although the text claims that Samson served as a savior and judge of the Israelites, this contention is not really supported by the cycle of stories in which he plays the leading role. While he is presented to us as a great and mighty hero in the mold of a Hercules or a Siegfried, his activities are limited to foreign climes, mainly among the Philistines, for whose women he apparently had a great weakness. Other than with his parents, Samson is not presented to us as interacting with nor acting on behalf of his fellow Israelites, except for the time the men of Judah come to him to take him prisoner and hand him over to the Philistines in order to ensure their own safety. Rather, he seems to be out solely for himself. Only the fact that he kills a lot of Philistines on account of the personal situation in which he finds himself would appear to confer on Samson the epithet of Israelite hero. Among the narratives of the Judges, The Samson story is the longest and may be divided into 4 sections, as you can see up here. First is his birth narrative, which is a prime example of the genre of the birth of the hero tale. Second is the story of his tragic marriage to a woman from Timnah, which lay on the border between Israel and Philistia. Third is an amusing and brief tale about his dalliance with a prostitute in Gaza. And fourth is his fatal relationship with Delilah, which would end with his death in the temple of the Philistine god Dagon, or Dagon. The story of Samson and Delilah is among the most familiar of biblical tales. In a nutshell, the muscle-bound skirt chaser Samson falls in love with a woman named Delilah who lives in the Sorek Valley. The Philistine rulers bribe her to learn the secret of his supernatural strength. After 3 failed attempts to find out the secret, Samson can no longer take Delilah's persistent questioning, or nagging, and reveals that his strength lies in his long hair. Delilah either cuts or has his hair cut and hands him over to the Philistines, after which she disappears from the story. Samson himself is blinded and enslaved. After his hair has grown back, the Philistines bring him into their temple, in which Samson prays to God for the return of his strength, whereupon he collapses the temple upon the Philistines and himself. In the following survey of the interpretation of the story of Samson and Delilah in representational art, the organizing principle will not be the structure of the narrative, but the historical progression of artworks depicted. In the course of this discussion, a number of questions will be addressed that each artist answers in a different manner. Among these, the most important are: first, did Delilah love Samson? The biblical text claims that Samson loved Delilah, but leaves the question open whether Delilah reciprocated his feelings for her. Second, what was Delilah's profession? The biblical text is silent regarding this matter. Most interpreters, however, have assumed that she was a prostitute, just like the woman from Gaza, with whom Samson had had a relationship in the verses immediately preceding the ones under consideration here. After all, who else would have betrayed a man for money? Third, what was Delilah's ethnicity? This motif is not addressed in the biblical text. Nonetheless, most commentators consider her a Philistine in the original ethnic sense of the term. After all, who else would have betrayed an Israelite? Fourth, who cut Samson's hair? The problem is that Judges 16:9 is somewhat ambiguous in the Masoretic or traditional Hebrew text. One may understand it to mean that Delilah called to Samson to make sure he was asleep before she proceeded to cut his hair. Alternatively, it may be understood, as it already is in a number of ancient translations of the Tanakh, to imply that Delilah called to someone else to cut Samson's hair. And fifth, what happened to Delilah after the fact? This question does not concern the biblical narrators, whose interest in her disappears as quickly as she does once Samson's hair has been shorn, although it has been the subject of much speculation for generations of interpreters. Let us begin with an illustration from the Weltchronik of Rudolf von Ems, which contains a number of elements that will accompany us on our journey. Characteristic of depictions of the scene during the late Middle Ages is the fact that both protagonists are modestly dressed. No extraneous centimeter of skin is exposed. Nonetheless, their red cloaks indicate that there is more going on than a man simply getting a haircut. Samson has fallen asleep in Delilah's lap while she grasps a large pair of scissors or shears to cut his hair herself. The two round objects partly framing the scene are leaf-bearing trees, indicating that the couple is outside, where they may freely frolic far from prying eyes. The next painting, by Francesco Morone, brings us closer to civilization. Once again, the pair is modestly dressed, but their red clothes hint at the events that took place before this moment. Although they are still outside, they are now on a terrace where they are removed from other people but not completely alone. This time it is not Delilah, but a young man who cuts Samson's hair. The barber's unusual position, peeking out from under Delilah's cloak, may indicate that whatever took place between the lovers was not particularly energetic, unless we are to assume that the barber has just arrived. On the other hand, since I'm reminded of the scene in Nobel Prize winner in literature Günter Grasse's novel The Tin Drum, in which Oscar's grandmother is impregnated in a potato field by a fleeing soldier who hides under her voluminous skirt, it is not outside the realm of the possible for the barber to have remained hidden under Delilah's cloak for some time. The red sky in this otherwise gray-toned or griselle painting by Andrea Mantegna conveys the erotic nature of the scene to the viewer. Once again, the pair is outdoors, while the fountain indicates that civilization has not been completely left behind. And this time it is Delilah who cuts Samson's hair. However, there are two aspects of this picture that deserve special mention. First, the couple is no longer modestly dressed. Can you all see this, or can we get is Jonathan here? I don't know which switch there. Oh yeah, Jonathan, can you see this? I'll hope I can read still. Thank you. First, the couple is no longer modestly dressed. As a result of their intense lovemaking, their clothes have slipped off their shoulders. And second, the tree under which they lie is meant to remind us of the tree in the Garden of Eden, where once before a woman supposedly led a man fatally astray. This interpretation, which we will encounter again, is reinforced by the grapevine, a symbol of drunkenness and sin that snakes around the tree. Is Mantegna attempting to imply that Delilah was only able to seduce Samson by making him inebriated, just as the daughters of Lot did to their father in Genesis 19? This depiction of the story by Hans Burgmeier contains a number of familiar elements, including a completely dressed pair. Nonetheless, they look somewhat disheveled. In addition, the remains of a meal, presumably including alcoholic beverages, are to be found in the lower left-hand corner. Samson himself is depicted as an old and drunken fool who has easily let himself be seduced by an appreciably younger woman. I will briefly return to this unique portrayal of the old and besotted Samson somewhat later in my remarks. As far as I'm aware, this is the first illustration to move the events of the narrative from the outdoors into Delilah's bedroom. Thus, the supposed lovers are no longer depicted in the manner of a couple of teenagers doing it in the bushes. Now we find ourselves in Delilah's boudoir, namely her place of employ. In other words, the artist Anton Wunzam leaves no doubt that he views Delilah as a professional prostitute, as the massive bed that dominates the background and the two pictures on the dresser indicate. Behind the bed, two Philistines wait for the signal to capture the sleeping Samson. And in the foreground, Delilah holds Samson's head in her lap, and dips her hand in some water in order to assist the barber in his task. An example of a type of cooperation that is, as far as I know, unique in depictions of this scene. This painting by Lucas Cranach the Elder does not add that much to our comprehension of the scene, but it does allow me to show a picture by one of my favorite artists. Those who are familiar with his numerous depictions of Adam and Eve will immediately notice the similarity between the tree under which Delilah is cutting Samson's hair and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden as he often painted it. As his many paintings of Adam and Eve, Venus and Cupid, and the Judgment of Paris indicate, Cranach did not shy away from representations of the naked human body. Thus it is all the more surprising that he chose to depict both Samson and Delilah, as he did the biblical Bathsheba in the bath, as fully dressed, even if clothed in red and out in nature. As we enter the Baroque period, the intimacy of previous representations is lost, only to be replaced by scenes of overactive dramatic impact. In this busy tableau by Jodocus van Wenche, we encounter our first depiction of Samson's capture. The number of figures and the building in classical style all serve in different ways to emphasize the drama of a lost world. Samson, painted with a naked upper torso, defends himself in vain, while the Philistines, assisted by Delilah, struggle to subdue him. The hair cut from Samson's head lies on the ground, while the Philistine holds the shears in his right hand and reaches for one of his last locks with his left. Delilah's naked breast indicates the nature of the encounter with Samson. Although artistic representations contrasting a woman's lighter skin with a man's darker skin may be traced back to ancient Egypt, its use here serves to highlight the difference between Delilah's indoor profession and Samson's outdoor life. The story of Samson and Delilah became a frequent motif in 17th century Dutch and Flemish art. In contrast to the previous painting, this one by Christian van Calverberg makes a much more intimate impression. The action is reduced to the sleeping Samson, the worried Delilah, and the barber. Samson's characteristic weapon, namely the jawbone of an ass, lies in the foreground. Samson himself lies naked under a strategically placed blanket or cloak. Even though Delilah still wears her dress, both her upper body and her feet are exposed. She holds Samson's head gently in her left hand in a gesture that may be interpreted either as loving or as hypocritical. Her right hand is raised in a cautionary manner, while her face expresses her fear and worry that Samson may awaken before the deed is done. Among many others, Van Dyck, Rubens, and Rembrandt all painted the dramatic tale of Samson and Delilah multiple times, experimenting with various interpretations of the subject matter. In this painting by Anthony Van Dyck, the contrast between Samson, the outdoorsman, and Delilah, the queen of the night, is conveyed in a stark manner. In addition to the aforementioned difference in skin tone, Samson is clothed in a rough fur or leather garment, while Delilah wears a silken dress and lies on a luxurious carpet. With one of her hands, she appears to caress Samson. The other is raised in a cautionary gesture. Both the barber and the Philistines lying in wait are familiar motifs. Conversely, the two women looking over Delilah's shoulder represent a new element. Their red clothes indicate their professional association with the brothel in which this scene is placed. The elderly woman is probably to be understood as the madam, who has a great financial interest in the action, or is it transaction, taking place. Another painting by Van Dyck illustrates Samson's capture. The contrast between the living and working spheres of the protagonist is highlighted by the contrasting backgrounds associated with the two erstwhile lovers. Of particular interest is Delilah's ambivalent depiction. On the one hand, she has betrayed Samson. On the other, she is simply a cog in a larger machine, one who has seemingly been forced to do this terrible deed. With one hand, she reaches out in vain to Samson, who has been torn from her grasp. Although the scissors have fallen from her other hand, indicating her active participation in Samson's betrayal, her apparent agony is expressed by that other hand, which now grasps at the silken or satiny sheets in conflicted torment and pain. These same two scenes were also painted by Peter Paul Rubens. That he locates Samson's betrayal in a tawdry brothel is indicated by the symbols that are really familiar to us. To underline this attribution, however, Rubens adds a statue of Venus, the goddess of love, and her son Cupid in a niche in the wall in the background. The apprehensive Philistines wait outside the door, while the madam of the brothel is to be seen to the left, and the barber stands in the middle. The muscular Samson has fallen asleep in Delilah's lap, while Delilah lays her hand lovingly on his shoulder and observes him with a wistful expression. The impression she conveys is one of detachment from what is going on around her. The characterization of Delilah in this second painting by Rubens is completely different. This time, she is the one who has shorn Samson's head. The dastardly deed done, she turns away from Samson back toward the world of the brothel. Samson looks away from Delilah as if to indicate that he knows how lacking in loyalty the heart of a prostitute is. Rembrandt also affords us the opportunity to compare how one artist views both the betrayal and the capture of Samson. In this first painting, the protagonists are no longer represented in the neoclassical style, but in Rembrandt's fantastic Oriental world. Both Samson and Delilah are fully clothed. After Samson has fallen asleep in Delilah's lap, she calls to the barber and points to Samson's locks, which the worried man is about to cut. Another fearful Philistine hides behind the curtain. There is no doubt that Delilah is the one who pulls the strings and is the one who has actively betrayed Samson. Delilah's triumph is depicted in this painting, which in my opinion belongs to the most brutal in the history of European art. Rembrandt shows Samson's agony with astounding realism at the very moment the Philistines poke out his eyes. As a dagger plunges into his eye and blood spurts out of the wound, which you probably can't see here, but if you see the picture in actuality in front of you, then it is extremely noticeable. As a dagger plunges into his eye and blood spurts out of the wound, Samson's contorted body bears witness to his unbearable suffering. Nonetheless, his remaining might is indicated by the number of Philistines it takes to hold him down and capture him. In the background, Delilah runs from the scene, holding the shears in one hand and Samson's hair in the other. Leaving aside the brutal realism of Rembrandt, this painting by Jan Steen, once again not the only time the artist dedicated himself to this dramatic story, serves not only to illustrate the narrative, but also to afford the artist the opportunity to stuff as many people as possible into a confined space. Nonetheless, a couple of new interpretative elements may be identified here, which expand the narrative's hermeneutic possibilities. Among others, Samson's coming humiliation in the temple of Dagon is anticipated by the boy who leads him away from Delilah like a dog on a leash. While manacled, Samson looks horror-stricken at Delilah, from whose hands the shears have dropped. With her right hand, Delilah reaches out to Samson, but with the left, she reaches for the silver she has received from the Philistine lords in payment for her act of betrayal. And to convey the extent of Samson's humiliation and to underline her professional attribution, Delilah's next customer already grasps her exposed breast before Samson's soon-to-be blinded eyes. Before leaving the 17th century, I would like to take a glance at a couple of distinctive Italian paintings. The first is by Giovanni Francesco Barbieri, better known as Guercino. As an example of the Baroque style, this painting depicts the capture of Samson. Unlike the curly-locked Philistines capturing him, Samson sports a crew cut. Delilah, while fully clothed in red, shows no sign of feelings for Samson. Indeed, as Samson is dragged from her, she pushes him away with one hand and tugs at the sheet in which Samson has become entangled with the other in order to wrench it back from his grasp. Her job done, she wishes to have no more to do with her victim. In this unique painting by Caravaggio or one of his followers, Samson lies corpse-like in the middle of the scene. His tight-fitting, diaphanous clothes highlight his masculine beauty. Unlike other depictions of the shorn Samson, in which he still sports hair, albeit short, in this portrayal, his head has been shaven clean in a manner considered the height of fashion nowadays. But don't hold your breath waiting for me to adopt this look. Delilah, clad in red with her bosom exposed through a diaphanous bodice, cautions the approaching Philistines with one hand, while she holds not scissors, but a straight-edged razor in the other. Rather than binding him with cords, the Philistines cautiously chain him with manacles. Adriaan van der Werf takes us back to a cool neoclassical style. Delilah, who looks like a marble statue, carefully cuts Samson's hair. And those who are familiar with Cecil B. DeMille's filmed version of the story from 1949 will notice the striking resemblance between van der Werf's Samson and that of Victor Mature, who played the role in the film and was, in my humble opinion, one of the worst actors of all time. The closer we get to modern times, the more explicit the depiction of the sexuality inherent in this tale becomes. No longer is there a need to hint at the nature of the relationship between Samson and Delilah through the use of symbols and metaphors. This process is encapsulated in this painting by John Francis Rigaud, in which all that protects the viewers from Samson's complete nakedness is a strategically placed corner of the bedsheet. One might be tempted to interpret this picture, which depicts an earlier unsuccessful attempt of Delilah to force the secret of his strength from Samson, as an advertisement for the sexual play of bondage and domination. No wonder Samson gave in to Delilah's urging. It was not because he was too stupid to learn from his previous experiences. On the contrary, it was because it all appeared to be an erotic game to him. This increasingly unfettered sexuality is further developed in this enormous canvas in which Frederick Richard Pickersgill has depicted the encounter between Samson and Delilah as a fantastic oriental orgy. The setting, combining aspects of both a brothel and a temple, would appear to be within a sanctuary of carnal love, in which the devotees of the divinity or divinities worshipped indulge in erotic rites. Samson, portrayed as a muscular giant, lies draped over Delilah's bed, while an African slave, don't forget we are currently in the middle of the 19th century, carefully cuts his hair. Delilah, who has done her duty, pulls back in horror. However, it is unclear whether this is because of her antipathy towards Samson or because of her fear of rousing him. Alexandre Cabanel's Delilah shows no emotion. Even though Samson has fallen asleep in her lap, nothing in this picture indicates that she has any natural human relationship with or feelings for him. Neither of her hands touches him. Indeed, she seems completely detached from the man sleeping in her lap. Rather, she employs both of her hands to caution the approaching barber to be cautious. As biblicist and cultural historian Cheryl Exum has shown, Delilah was a favorite motif of Gustave Moreau, who delighted in depicting her as a shameless courtesan. In this painting, the long and languid Samson lies half on the floor and half on Delilah, surrounded by phantasmagorical oriental luxury. He is besotted with love, while she gazes at us in a cold and detached manner. In many respects, this depiction of Samson is the binary opposite of Burgmaier's Old and Drunken Fool. In this painting, Samson is represented as a young and quasi-androgynous figure who has just begun discovering love and is overwhelmed by it. Thus, he reminds us more of Mozart and Da Ponte's Cherubino or Strauss and von Hofmannsthal's Octavian than of a mythic hero and strongman such as Hercules or Siegfried. In spite of the fact that this lecture is dealing with art as Midrash, it is only now that we encounter our first Jewish artist, the British Solomon Joseph Solomon, a student of Cabanel. The center of this painting is dominated by Samson. Even though his hair has been shorn, the Philistines are barely able to overwhelm him. While he struggles mightily against his capture, he looks back at Delilah with an accusatory and shocked glance. Delilah is depicted in a unique manner. While other artists oftentimes leave the question of Delilah's feelings for Samson open, Solomon's Delilah is clearly filled with the deepest hatred for her victim. Wildly triumphant, she laughs mockingly in his face and scornfully waves both his shorn locks and her breasts before his soon-to-be blinded eyes. This painting by Lovis Corinth represents a further development in the depiction of Samson and Delilah. As far as I'm aware, this is one of the first times that both protagonists appear completely naked. Echoing Rembrandt, Samson lies on his back, struggling mightily but in vain against his captors, while Delilah hovers over her victim in the background like a vulture, waiting to tear the last morsel of flesh from his bones. However, the picture that in my opinion represents the most audacious and blatantly sexual depiction of the action is a small painting, perhaps no more than a sketch, by Max Liebermann, in which he has reduced the incident of the hair cutting to nothing but pure sex. Other than the bed, which is merely hinted at, all that can be seen are the completely naked bodies of Samson and Delilah. She is kneeling with her back to the viewer, and cutting Samson's locks from his head. He has fallen asleep between her legs, with his head nestled against her pubic region. The scene thus reminds us of the Bible's description of the death of the Canaanite general Sisera between Yael's legs in Judges chapters 4 and 5, mixing eros and thanatos, or love and death, to convey what in French is aptly called le petit mot, but a Freudian may refer to as a symbolic castration. A slightly older and larger canvas by the same artist depicts the same figures a few moments later in the narrative. Delilah waves Samson's hair as a signal to the Philistines to come and capture the sleeping Israelite hero. As the complete nakedness of the protagonists and the rumpled sheets indicate, it is once again obvious that Samson has fallen asleep following a sexual encounter. During the middle of the same decade as the paintings by Corinth and Lieberman, the Russian Jewish artist Boris Schatz, the future founder of the Bezalel School of Art in Jerusalem, produced this painted plaster relief of Delilah's betrayal of Samson. Significantly, at the time of his wife's desertion of him for one of his students. A long-haired Samson sleeps post-coitally underneath a sheet, while a disheveled Delilah extends her hand to her servant who is handing her a pair of shears that recalls much older artistic traditions. Lest we do not pick up on the theme of female betrayal, the scene is framed by mirror image depictions of a naked Eve entwined with a phallic serpent. Schatz's subconscious is in this case not even skin deep. And amusingly enough, he gave this as a present to his daughter. Taking up the theme of Samson's capture, Marc Chagall depicted the same scene as the second one by Lieberman, but in a different manner. Delilah, more or less clothed with only one breast exposed, sits in her tent with a naked Samson asleep in her lap. As in the case of the second painting by Lieberman, she waves Samson's hair in the air as a signal to the Philistines. However, arising out of Chagall's lifelong preoccupation with his origins in an East European shtetl, the inimical Philistines are represented as Orthodox Jews. This ethnic role reversal calls to mind a controversial staging of Camille Saint-Saëns's opera Samson et Delilah, or Samson Delilah, that was mounted in Antwerp a few years ago, in which the Philistines were depicted as modern Israelis and the ancient Israelites as contemporary Palestinians. Turning back to Chagall, if the Philistines are depicted as Jewish men, would this also make Delilah Jewish? At the same time, through his use of imagery, Chagall forges another link to the aforementioned story of Yael and Sisera in Judges 4 and 5. A painting which may remind us of Lieberman's little sketch is this one by Suzanne Clairac. Only the perspective has been slightly altered. Instead of turning her back to the viewer, Delilah now faces us. Once again she kneels with Samson asleep between her legs. The question of ethnic identity also plays a role here. Whereas Lieberman's wall is blank, on Clairac's a 7-branched candelabrum, or a menorah, is to be seen. Since the action takes place chez Delilah, is Clairac implying that Delilah is an Israelite? If so, her interpretation would differ significantly from most others, but would appear to be consonant with Chagall's role reversal. The last two illustrations I would like to discuss are inspired more by Sanson's opera than they are by the biblical text. In Franciszek Starobiewski's poster for a production of Samson and Delilah at the Wrocław Opera, Samson and Delilah have literally become objectified. Reduced to a semi-naked body, the muscular Samson sports not a head, but a fluted column. Symbolic of the column supporting the temple of Dagon, he is fated to topple on his enemies and himself. Meanwhile, Delilah's completely naked torso is crowned by the antique scissors she will use to unman Samson, an action that seems to be indicated by the positioning of Samson's phallic columnar head between the blades of Delilah's heady shears. This last picture, by Cristina Alvarez Mariano, breaks out of the mold of the biblical narrative. Indeed, it is part of a series of depictions of operatic heroines, and shows us a contented Delilah after her betrayal of Samson. Like a starlet in Hollywood or a bather on the Riviera, she is lying topless on the beach or near a pool. Reflecting the symbolism of older works of art, what little clothing she wears is red, and that color frames her. The addition of a number of other symbols leaves no doubt that we are in the presence of Delilah after her betrayal of Samson. Although they are the wrong color, the stripes on her beach towel make it appear as if she is lying on a talit, a Jewish prayer shawl. On the lower left-hand side are Samson's shorn hair and the ancient or medieval shears used to cut it. Above them are the silver coins that Delilah received as a bribe in payment from the Philistine potentates. In the upper right-hand corner are the chains with which Samson was bound, and on the lower right is an anachronistic yellow Star of David, which Delilah has presumably cut off of Samson's clothing to serve as a trophy, like his hair. In addition, her own long hair is prominently displayed, thus ironically commenting on Samson's current lack of same. In other words, this is a Delilah who has no moral qualms about what she has done and is enjoying the fruits of her labors. What may we then conclude from this somewhat superficial survey of pictorial art during the last 700 years? First, that most artists have viewed Delilah as a Philistine, although some have also implied that she was an Israelite. Second, that most artists have depicted Delilah as a prostitute. Third, that there is no consensus about who cut Samson's hair. The same artist may attribute the deed to Delilah or to some anonymous Philistine barber. Fourth, that there are differing opinions regarding Delilah's feelings for Samson. According to some artists, Delilah to some extent reciprocated Samson's affections. According to others, she hated him. And some are as ambivalent in answering this question as they are in representing Delilah. And finally, we have seen how the portrayal of the sexuality inherent in the Samson-Delilah narrative has become ever more openly depicted and displayed. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Rebecca Starkman to come up to give thanks for the wonderful talk we just heard.
Thanks, Rona. First, I'd like to thank Professor Carl Ehrlich for his engaging talk on Art as Midrash, the story of Samson and Delilah. I personally had no idea that this many depictions of the story existed, So thanks for the probably introductory survey. My father would have undoubtedly enjoyed the lecture as well. He would have likely been waiting to discuss various points and ideas with me following. Thank you to Leslie Simpson, Rona Kasansky, and Jordan Glick for their planning and leadership efforts. Your attention to detail and commitment to the event is clearly evident this evening. Finally, I'd like to thank the Darchei Noam Art Committee and the Friends of Joel Starkman Group for co-sponsoring this event. These friends, including Jordan Glick and Rona Kasansky, Michael and Pam Albert, John Hussman, Ben and Elise Walderman, Howard Goldman, Dean Fisher, Danny Gelman, and Dan Sturman, formed friendships with my father back in their middle and high school years. I know he always valued the time we spent together and was proud of the length and strength of your relationships. Your choice to sponsor a lecture related to art and Bible, my father's own area of research, is the most fitting way to mark his second yahrzeit. On behalf of my family, thank you for your thoughtfulness and your generosity.
Thank you again. Thank you, Professor Ehrlich. Thank you all for coming. Hopefully you found it as interesting, educational, and entertaining as I did. Please do stay and join us for coffee and cookies and conversation. Thanks again.
Yeah, that was disappointing. Yeah. I think we'd be familiar enough. Yeah.
I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
You didn't know who it is?
No Q&A. That's surprising. Even the way it ended, it was so abrupt. I was like, well, thanks for coming.
Spoke really well. The nerve video to say that.
Did you get it all? I hope so.